Hey everyone, I'm just getting set up here. Right, can you guys hear me okay? Just do a quick sound check before. Yes, thank you. Good. Please do shout. Say this now before we get started, really. But our network connection's been a bit flaky for the past half an hour, so please do shout in the chat if you see that my connection's dying or anything like that. I will try and switch over to my mobile if it's not got the best bandwidth, so try it like this to start. But yeah, please do shout. Right. I'm just going to give it 1 minute for people to join, because I know it was the previous session. So how's everybody found it today? Has it been a good day for everyone? Yeah, it's been lots of interesting talks. So got to do some catching up on the first ones. But yeah, we're in the same boat there. Yeah. Yeah, it really is. So Philip, I'm just seeing your comment there. It's really interesting to see like the widespread use of maps as well. It's been great. Cool. Okay, right. Well, I think what I'll do is just start to get rolling here. Should be enough time for everybody to join. So welcome. Welcome. Just getting set up here. So hi, I'm Steve. So in this session, I'm going to look at how maps can be used to create more effective organizational structures that are based on interconnected services. And that sounds great, right? Hopefully so. But of course, if you're anything like me, then you're wondering, more effective than what? So then the most common way of organizing, of course, right? So the functional hierarchy, or what we know and love, org charts. This works better with examples. So I'm going to start with one here. So this is the organizational structure of a client of mine, or a former client of mine called Modal. Modal is a made-up name, of course, and so are all the people on this diagram, just to protect identities and such, but it is a real company. And this 3-level deep snapshot is from a few years ago. So let's go through this org chart and see what insights we can extract from how they're structured. Now, I've spent a while analyzing their business model, their company configuration, and the market trends. I've also interviewed many of their employees, and then I wrote a report that outlined the number of issues that I found that they were facing, and I suggested ways to navigate them. So I've got a good idea of what was going on at the time, and I figure we can compare to that. So first, it looks like they're a small organization, medium to small organization, or an SMB. They've got, looks about 150 people, if I count this up. Our second insight, they look like a delivery-focused engineering organization with, as you can see, about 100-odd people under the delivery director there. That's about 3/4 or 75% of all their employees. So it's probably software engineering rather than civil or electrical or mechanical, given the UX and the QA roles that you'll see there under the delivery director. Okay. Our third insight, if it really is a software engineering company, it's a bit odd that the CTO reports to the COO. Right? CTO is the Chief Technology Officer, if you're not familiar with the term, and COO is a Chief Operating Officer. So if you take that and the fact that all of the engineers report to the delivery director, not the CTO, it's a bit strange. I wonder what's up with that. Fourth, well, they've got a retail, strategy, and consulting departments, it looks like. Now, there's not too many people in the consultancy department, and the retail department looks a lot smaller than the delivery. Same with strategy. So they probably do some sort of software engineering and consulting around the retail space. Fifth, the leadership team. Well, let's look at gender diversity. They've got 27% women and 73% men. Now, that's a far cry from an even split, but it's better than no gender diversity at all. And I do see that quite a bit. And there's no mention of cultural or racial diversity, but looking just at the names, it does look like it's a UK, yeah, more of a classic UK organization with little cultural or racial diversity in there, at least at the leadership level. 6, why is there a finance manager and a financial controller? Come to think of it, finance manager is an odd title for somebody at this level, and they've got no direct reports. So that makes me think again, maybe there is actually a gender bias or glass ceiling kind of issue going on after all. That was informative, wasn't it? I'm not sure about you, but even though I learned a lot, I still really don't know what this company actually does. Who are its customers? What are their needs? And how does it meet these needs? How does it make money? Why is it structured like this versus any other way? And there's many different ways it could be structured. Well, why is it structured like this? So at this point, it's kind of clear that, at least to me, that we need other sources of information to answer these kind of questions. Great, but let's not give up on the org chart too quickly. Let's try and find out all the information that we need and just update the org chart. Okay, so from their website, I found out that they do digital strategy and digital transformation. So I've added that up top. They also do e-commerce sites, and they say for fashion retailers, for DIY stores, that kind of thing. Okay, that's added on too. And they also do content sites, and they focus on publishers and sporting teams and that kind of stuff. Okay, added in, right? That's all at the top now. Great. Here's all the shareholdings. Great, okay, yeah. Thank you, Companies House. Let's add those in. And now we see that it wasn't actually a gender bias issue after all. Right? Annie owned 22% of the company. She could have given herself any title she liked. Wow, it's a bit strange. If you look at the CTO, they've also got a disproportionately low shareholding compared to the other execs. Right, so again, this is like the chief technical officer. So, okay, another question mark around there. And in fact, if you look at it, all the minority shareholders report to majority shareholders. It looks like maybe there's a small circle of trust here. Okay, interesting. So then I went on, did some interviews, and I uncovered several personal relationships during them. So let's update the view with that, right? Look into it, and oh, well, look at the top there, right? So it's more of a business run by family and old friends. Annie and Bob are married, and Jack's been friends with Bob for years. So together, the three of them have a majority shareholding. Okay, that makes sense. And Bob and Annie's joint shareholding of 45% actually suggests that finance is a key driving force of the company, despite the title. Right. The other shareholders, I found out, all came from acquisitions. And, the CTO is really not part of that old friends network. And he also reports to the COO. I bet he has to work twice as hard to be heard by the rest of the leadership team. That's kind of unlucky, especially considering it looks like it's an engineering firm. So on to more interviews and then reviewing documentation and such, right? And it turns out they use a shared resources model primarily for software engineering projects and support with some design and consulting. Okay, so we've added shared service resources on there. They also build by the hour, except for their ITIL-like support, which is usually a fixed monthly fee. And sometimes they did fixed price, fixed scope work, but in general, they prefer to do agile projects on a time and materials basis. And each project had a profit and loss account, and so does each billable resource. And that's a person, by the way. So if a project manager runs too many loss-making projects, or if an individual doesn't meet their billability targets, they're at high risk of losing their job. And incidentally, this encouraged a culture that valued being billable over delivering value. Okay, well, let's add that stuff into, and that's bottom right. What about their finances? Well, at the time, they were losing money. They were struggling actually with an identity crisis as they tried to adapt to a changing market. In short, not fun times, really. They had all this data at project and individual levels, as well as the organization as a whole. But I couldn't really find an easy way to fit it on here without doing a ton of work. So I just squashed the graph into the bottom left corner there. Hope that's all right with you. Okay, right. So that's quite a lot of information. We've got now a better idea of how they perform, and this describes it pretty well, right? Well, let's do a quick recap of what we learned. So org charts are very efficient at showing you some of the power dynamics, i.e. the formal ones. but they don't capture the informal power dynamics like share ownership, personal relationships, or similar interests and such. And as you can see, these are often as important as the hierarchy itself. In fact, in this case, they defined the hierarchy. But moreover, org charts don't shed much light on who the customers are, what their needs are, and how you meet those needs. Now, for that, we need to know the internal dynamics, such as the inter-team dependencies, what methods are used, the key metrics, the flows of value, flows of capital, that kind of stuff. And these are the things that we call really part of something called an operating model. Now you can layer some of this stuff onto an org chart, but as you've already seen, that gets pretty complicated fast, and it's of questionable value. So on their own, org charts are not really the best tool for this. So my question was, can maps do any better? Well, let's try it. Let's try it. Here's a simplified map of Modal's e-commerce business. Now this makes it quite clear who the customer is and what they need, right? So the customer needs an e-commerce site, or they need some e-commerce advice, right? Advice about e-commerce sites, basically. It also shows what Modal did to meet those needs. Right? So they had e-commerce frameworks, they did user interface customizations, bespoke customizations to the framework, as well as integrating third parties, supporting things and hosting stuff. Great. Yes, they also did content and strategy, and that's not on this map, but you can draw separate maps for those. So how are we doing here? Well, we don't see much by way of the power structures on there, but we've covered off user needs, flow value, as that's kind of built into the map. And flow of capital can be done if you've got the data. We'll get to that. What about the team dependencies and methods and metrics? Well, let's imagine Modal's shared resources model was made up of 4 teams, which isn't so far off. Well, if you draw that up on the map, then the inter-team relationships start popping out at you. Right? The delivery team, the delivery team here depends on ops and UX teams. The consulting team, you can see, depends on the delivery team. Great. Okay. Well, you can also guess at the methods too if you start using the pioneers, settlers, town planner model of Simon's. So the PST model, right? So purple are town planners, and they use very structured methods focused on reducing deviations, like ITIL. And blue is for settlers, right, who tend to use more lean methods like Scrum or Lean Kanban and that kind of stuff. So they really only had these 2 at this organization. Well, that's a little better. So we've got a way of identifying team dependencies, and we can guess at what the methods are being used, but we don't have a mechanism for success metrics here. Well, this comes back to a blog post that Simon Wardley wrote in 2015 that discussed a cell-based team structure that uses fitness functions to measure how each cell performs. I've put the link there. If anybody's interested, I can post it in the chat later. But if you think about why we need metrics, well, that's why, right? We use them to learn. We use them to evaluate things. And in an organizational context, we can use them to learn about or evaluate the performance of a team. In this example, we're using some variable called X to evaluate this cell-based team. Well, if you accept that, then the obvious question is, what the heck is X? Simon also talked about how one cell can be the customer of another cell, and that these interfaces should really help to define these fitness functions. So this is all part of his design for constant evolution principle. So yeah, what is X? Maybe this interface idea can help us answer that question. So you might visualize it something like this, right? The way that cell 3 interfaces with its customers, cells 1 and 2, defines the fitness function. Oh, thanks, Vicky. That's awesome. So yeah, so cells 1 and 2, they interface with cell 3 to define the fitness function. And if you want the link to that blog article, then Vicky's just posted it in there. So this makes sense, right? But you still need to find some way to define that fitness function, right? So how can you do that? Well, the key is in the value chain, right? It's the user need. So X really is something about the need that a cell serves. The challenge is then to come up with metrics that measure how well each user need is being met, right? So that's the key. And this is really, really powerful, right? So a company that treats a user need as a fundamental unit of organizational design will be able to adapt to the changes in those needs as components inevitably evolve. So it's a really powerful idea. So maybe there is a way to define metrics using wordly maps, even though it's not shown really as part of the map. If we use the needs of the consumer teams internally, that is, and the customers externally. So if we use those needs to drive the metrics, then we're essentially introducing a new kind of adaptive formal power structure. And that's really interesting. So, sounds really interesting at least. It's a nice theory. Does it work in practice? Well, the short answer is yes. Right. So this is something that James Duncan has been working on for several years now. So James Duncan's part of an organization called Stance, and they've created something called the Organized Services Operating Model, or AWESOME for short, because, well, it's awesome. Anyway, this model offers a simple cell-based company structure with a central form of governance. So in this case, the services are the cells, right? So I'll use the term interchangeably from here. So this is all based on Simon's universal principle. So the whole operating model is derived from that. And of course, it's all Simon's stuff is Creative Commons. So Organized Services Operating Model is also freely available under Creative Commons. And it can be introduced into organizations either wholesale or piecemeal. Right? And we'll see in a moment how it fits with organizations that still use a functional hierarchy. The two can go hand in hand. So it's got two fundamental organizing units. First, you've got the network of services, which you can see an example of there. And each of these services delivers on a set of carefully articulated needs. Secondly, you've got the executive, which provides oversight and governs the network. So this model has been used at both at small companies, like startups and such, and large organizations like the. So let's dig into it a bit. The interface needs are documented in something called a service contract, and that governs the way that the service is delivered. I've put service agreement on here. It should be service contract. So apologies for that. The service is then managed by a service manager who's accountable for designing, building, operating, and supporting the service. And they're free to do this however they please, right? However they see fit. So that could involve breaking the service down into sub-teams as needed. And something that I've seen people doing is using team topologies to help try and figure that stuff out. If you want to talk about that, then yeah, ask me in the Q&A. We can talk a little bit more about that. So here, the service managers also choose which management methods are going to be used. And they maintain a wordly map for the service to show how the needs are being met and also to help the executive understand this as well as clients and get into some more of the strategic thinking around how the services are run and also how the network is managed. So those maps are essential. The service can be consumed by people inside or outside of the organization, right? So if you imagine you're all the way you're customer facing, then obviously that would be somebody outside the organization. If the customer presumably outside the organization can't be present to represent their own needs, then a service owner is appointed to represent them. Each service reports on the set of metrics that they define, right, to help people understand how effective the service is. And this typically includes consumption costs so that the organization can understand how and why it's spending the money in the first place. And, as before, right, so together these metrics form a fitness function. And I'll show you an example of that in a bit. So the executive is either an individual. So, and again, this is the other main part of Organized Services Operating Model. The executive is either an individual or a team. If they're a team, then they speak with a single voice. They exist really to govern the network. And they can create, they can alter, they can retire services as they see fit. They set budgets for each service, and they issue mandates to them to influence the network. A mandate can be considered a set of strong strategic recommendations rather than a definitive directive. So it's a you should rather than thou shalt. They also issue guidance for service managers to consider and adopt or reject based on how they run their service. And this is all done with an understanding that a regular service assessment is going to be done, and the service manager will be in those sessions asked to either defend or well, ultimately defend their decisions, right? So if they're not accepting guidance, then there should be a good reason. If there's not a good reason, and if a service manager is continuously failing to deliver a service that meets its users' needs, then the executive can choose to replace a service manager or spin down the service. But this is really a power that should be used sparingly. Because the general idea is that these services are autonomous, they manage themselves, and they seek to perform well to meet their users' needs. So contracts are key to all of this, right? They're part of the formal power structure. This is a template contract for that I've created. So here you can see, and this is a Miro template, by the way. So here you can see you've got the service name and who manages it. You've got its stage of life cycle, right? So, and for this is something that, again, included in the Organize Services operating model. You'll see there's a number of defined stages of life cycle. You've got discovery, alpha, beta, live, decommissioned. It's also got a stage of orderly evolution, right? And that makes it easy to then take the service and position it on a map. You've got a description that gives you a quick overview and most importantly, how to engage. You've also got a list of the user needs. And this is, again, where the key interfaces are defined and where the metrics come from. The metrics, of course, taken all together, they define a fitness function. I've given a few examples here, and we'll get into some real-world stuff in a second. And of course, you've got a worthy map of the service. So and that's where your customers and your dependencies come from. So again, the user needs act as the interface, and the metrics make that fitness function. So from the contracts, you can easily create a worthy map of interconnected services. And you can zoom into each service and see more detailed maps that a service manager maintains. It's pretty cool, right? It's also very useful. So if you drew up an org chart of a company using Organize Services operating model, it would look something like this. There is still a functional hierarchy, but it's very flat, as it directly matches the service network. And as I mentioned before, you can also embed this organizational model, right, this org chart, within an existing organization and start running part of an organization like. So that looks better, but the only thing we're not covering off really is these informal power structures. Well, this is better represented by a network diagram of individuals rather than a worthy map. You could also use Cognitive Edge's SenseMaker tool to map attitudes and dispositions in a much more effective way than you could on a worthy map, I would argue. So for that stuff, yeah, I would leave that to different tools, to better tools suited to the purpose. But this is covering off a lot of things. And it's actually worth pointing out that no matter where you are, informal power structures can have an impact on the formal ones as well, right? So even with a services model like this, an informal network could completely scupper the whole thing, right? So those are really, really important. There's more stuff, more on that, or we could dig more on that in the Q&A. So at this point, I'm going to introduce another client in the medical and pharma space. Let's call them Medico, where I'm actively working to help define the services in one of their departments using Awesome. So why are we doing this? We're doing this really to improve Medico's situational awareness by making their value chains and capital flow in particular transparent. I'll get onto capital flow in a bit more in a second if you've not heard of the term before. So by doing all of this, and it's not an insignificant amount of work, by doing it, we want to improve things like pricing. So are we charging the right things for our services? Are they being priced correctly? And also how we make decisions, right? And that's a number of different factors. Are we using the right components? So are we making the right decisions about those components in the right places, that is? Are we repeating ourselves, right? So duplication is already something I've seen quite a bit of. So are we repeating ourselves? If so, why? Is it necessary? What methods work in which context, right? So for a particular service, may make sense to use ITIL. For another service, it may make sense to use Prince2, and another one, it may make sense to use extreme programming. So lots of different choices there, and context is king, really. Then there's the outsourcing question, right? So should we build or should we buy? How do we make that decision? It comes down to, are we spending our money wisely? So I mentioned pricing and capital flow. It's really worth pointing out that capital flow is a big part of why we're doing this. So Medico currently track their budget in a big budget spreadsheet that's itemized at the vendor contract level. So each budget line item can be spread out across any number of teams in the department. And sometimes those line items are pretty vague. So it's really hard to understand where all the money actually goes. So our goal here is to improve our understanding of how capital flows between all of the services and what any given asset costs. So if you're new to capital flow, let me just give you a very quick example. So imagine a McDonald's selling a cup of tea for $1. Well, let's say that the average cost per use of a mug is 3 cents. And a tea bag costs 49 cents. Milk, 25. Hot water, when you add up all the parts, costs you 32 cents. Well, that's good to know. Turns out your average cup of tea costs $1.09. And you're making a loss. The first point is, and yes, it's a very contrived example, but the first point is you only know this if you do the numbers. Secondly, understanding the value chain and combining that with your business's context helps you make better decisions. Consider this, for example. What is McDonald's doing paying 49 cents per tea bag? If this was a high-end tea shop like Whitteds of Chelsea, then maybe they'd want to go and keep the fancy tea and put the prices up. But even then, they'd probably want to check out why their electricity bills. Right, so there's value in doing this. And let's get back to the Medico world, in the real world. So to get the ball rolling on this effort, I created some example services based on their context. And we ran some workshops to create a draft list of services with the department leads, where they showed me how wrong I was. And that was intentional, by the way. This usually takes a few sessions, and even then, you're never going to get your service network right on the first attempt. You just need to get everyone aligned on the vision ultimately, and then get started somewhere. And once you're going, you can course correct as you go. So in this effort, we identified the people responsible for the services, the services that we wanted to try and start defining, and at that point, we just started working with those people to define the contracts. As you can see, there are quite a number of services, and that has grown significantly since then. So here's a view of the mobile app services space, right? So I can't show you the whole network, but I can show you this part of it. And this is changing every week almost as we understand more and define more services. As you can see, we haven't yet added evolution in here, right? So this is a mapping conference. Where's evolution? I usually find it's much more manageable to add that in later. Right? The cognitive load is too high for people that are new to the concept. So we start out with value chains, and in this case, higher level service networks. We do have ideas of evolution for a lot of these, but trying to add it in now just confuses the point, I find. I can also point to the extent of services, right? So you can see here how the services interact with other clients in Medico that aren't using Awesome. The two can coexist, right? So those ones are noted in gray. And if this is too hard to see, right? So if you're looking at this on a small screen, I do have a mirror board where we can zoom into this and explore it in the Q&A. Right, and here's really the linchpin of all this. This is the first draft service contract that we wrote for their test app store. So if we look through this, well, you can see a number of things. First, you can see that Sally is managing the test app store, which is currently live and it's in production. Great. Sally sees this as a stage 3 to stage 4 from an evolution point of view. So it's a product that may well be in the commodity space these days. It's a little bit of a question around that. Scanning the description, you can see that Sally's service lets people beta test their apps. And at a glance, we know how to engage. We go into GitHub and we follow these instructions. Great. And we also know how to disengage, right? We simply remove some configuration. Of course, that's to be confirmed. And you'll find that you do have backs and forth on these while the contracts solidify. So it's actually a great way to get some niggly bits around your service actually settled out. So if you jump over to the right, we can see there's a list of user needs in story format. So this actually comes from James Duncan's recommendation. It's a great way of defining them because it lets you get at what really matters. So we spent a while on this, whittling down maybe 10 needs or so into these two. I also find it's really helpful to see how these needs plug into the value chain below. Right? The metrics are also derived from the user needs. So they're still in draft while Sally decides what's most important with her users. But you can see where we've started saying for one of the user needs, oh, let's measure the number of apps published, right? And then you see that in a bit more detail in the service metrics section. Notice that they're also defining a cost model, right? And this is something that the service currently doesn't have, right? So at the moment, we don't know how much the service is actually costing. So this effort will help to open that up and to give us better visibility on that. The value chain, which is, again, it's not yet a Wordly map, it shows how these needs are met, and it lists any service dependencies that are outside of the service. The customers and their dependencies are also listed on the left, just for convenience, but it's the same information. So once you've got all this stuff, you can start comparing your service to the market. And I've started doing just that in the top right, where you can see a number of alternatives that are available, and my mandate, a strong recommendation, to look into this once Sally has got all the cost figures that she needs to collect, because she may be burning money needlessly in maintaining a system that has since had market solutions become available. So switching to those could be a more effective way of delivering this service. Finally, you'll also notice that I've tacked on two boxes, right? Two sections to the bottom of this service agreement. This really is custom to Medico, and it's essential for how they'll be measuring capital flow. So let's take that capital flow concept again a little bit further here, right? So this is a quick model of a service from a capital flow perspective. So you incur costs for two main things: the activities of your service, right? So activities that you provide, or costs from other services, right? So for the assets that you're consuming there, or from direct consumption of another service. And of course, the service contract that you're starting to define will ultimately define how you bill your customers, right? So there'll be a cost model behind that. For Medico, the current plan is actually that all services will bill each other on a per asset basis, right? So in order to consume a service, you need an asset. And this will give them a fine-grained understanding of both their service costs and their asset costs. We're actually currently building a capital flow service that will help other managers track the flow of money between and inside their services. And this is going to help them develop cost models, evaluate financial performance, etc. In fact, in our early work on a prototype of this, we were able to create a drastically improved view of what each asset cost. And this information allowed my client to save $400K, which was a lot less than the investment put into it. So the general idea is to show capital flow in a map form, as well as the accounting breakdowns, kind of like this mockup, and that does have evolution and visibility axes on there, even if you can't see them. You can also show your service network this way, and you can make it interactive, right? So you can see the metrics and the contracts, as well as the capital flow, potentially even engage from a map. Our plan is to reuse as much of the open source software that's out there as possible, which may mean extending online Wordly maps, MapKeep, or something else. And we're also considering making parts of the engine itself, on the previous slide, open source, right? But it's early days. If you're interested in getting involved, just let me know, reach out on Twitter. Services are useless if nobody knows about them. Right? So you need to publish the information somewhere. And I say, well, okay, a service catalog. Right? So it's a familiar concept. And once you've got them in there, you can broadcast that out to users so that they can browse and easily engage with the service. The actual service performance metrics and all that should also be included. And of course, you need to bear in mind, some services may need to be access controlled if they're exposing sensitive data and things like that, right? So there's a bunch of considerations around this, but having your services defined in the catalog allows users to engage a lot more easily. So yeah, so I'm aware of time, right? So I think this is, I'll start wrapping up now, right? But like I say, in the Q&A, we can always dig into some more stuff. We've got a couple more slides left before I wrap up, but hopefully so far this has been a useful overview of how you can turn your org chart into something more meaningful using Wordly Maps and Organized Services operating model, which is really built on top of Wordly Maps to start thinking of better ways of organizing. I'd like to finish up on some of the benefits that we captured in a leadership session with the department a few weeks back. So I already mentioned the 400K savings, which, as I mentioned, is already more than paid for the effort invested. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? So there's data to guide pricing decisions, and there we can create a transparent profit and loss for individual assets and services. The real-time cost data can also be used to guide more cost-effective software development practices, right? And something that Alexander Simovich coined as FinDev or worth-based development, right? So given that information on how your services are actually performing, that can start to impact your development practices. The service metrics allow us to see how they're performing and compare them to what's available in the market, like that example I showed you. And that can drive better build versus buy decisions. The value chains that we produce help us develop a better understanding of the dependencies between teams. And this, as I've already mentioned, you can also use something like team topologies to do. But if you combine that with the fitness functions, this leads to more effective. And there, I know many organizations suffer from issues trying to coordinate, especially across teams and large delivery efforts within enterprises, right? So this is a promising way to address those issues. We've also got a much better way of detecting duplicate components. And there we can, once we've detected them, we can understand why do they exist, and then we can fix them. And this, I've seen already my client doing in multiple logging solutions, for example. Our service network finally can be used to create a common language, right? And this is a key one, right? So trying to bridge the gaps again between business and tech, as my client's trying to do. Something like this can really help. It goes a long way to help. So anyway, rather than me blathering on more, I figure we have a more interesting discussion if I stop now and ask if there's any questions. So yeah, any questions? I'm looking over at the Q&A. Okay, I'll go in order of time. So is it Joachim, or is it, I'm going to say Joachim. Do you want to jump on and tell me how to pronounce your name properly? I'm not sure if we can do that. So I'll just, while we're waiting for that to be sorted out, I'll just read out your question and try and answer it here. So what's the benefit or competitive advantage of using Organized Services operating model instead of ITIL plus Wordly Maps? So there, ITIL can exist within Organized Services operating model. In fact, that's one of the things that we're currently mapping out, is part of the organization that does provide support services in an ITIL kind of format. So the two aren't mutually exclusive. ITIL doesn't solve everything though. ITIL is very, it's focused on a particular mode of supporting technology, whereas Organized Services is much more generic. So for example, one of the things we're looking at is a flexible talent team, right? So, and that's not something that fits into ITIL. So you could also look at marketing functions with this and many other things, right? So if you're a medical equipment device manufacturing company, you could also look at that, right? So what kind of medical products do you have and services that you'd want to wrap around those? So to me, Organized Services is a more generic way of organizing, and therefore it's more applicable, more widely applicable than ITIL. So does that answer your question? Yep. Okay. Cool. I see your message there in the chat. Right. So I'll move on to the next question from Mike. So you mentioned team topologies. How does it overlap with Organized Services operating model for designing it? Is it due to the X as a service cooperation model? What about other ones? So really, Organized Services operating model, I do have a slide somewhere on here. Just going to try and find it. Slide ... Yeah, nope, I'm going to have to just cancel out of this. So somewhere down here. Here we go. Right, so I've tried to outline here a little bit about team topologies and the overlap with Organize Services operating model. So here you could imagine that a service can wrap around any number of these team types. Right, so it may make sense that you split out, for example, a framework team into its own service, the other services that depend on, or it may make sense that you inside a service include a frameworks team. Right, so I see team topologies as more like a way of exactly this, right? So trying to handle the cognitive load issues and handoffs and such. The Organized Services operating model does a little bit of that as well, but less so, right? It's not as focused on it, and it's certainly not as focused on the tech part of things. So in this case, team topologies really is complementary to Organized Services operating model in that respect, right? So hopefully that helps to answer that question. If not, then say something in the chat. Yep, cool. Thanks, Mike. Roberto. So Roberto's asking, how much do you think you lose from dropping the informal power structure to the service definition and the final costing structure? How much do you think you lose? Roberto, I'm not sure if you can expand a little bit on that. How much do you think you lose from dropping the informal power structure to the service definition? So I don't think you ever drop the informal power structure. I think there's always an informal power structure. It's just a matter of discovering it. And then there's a question of how closely the informal power structures map onto the formal ones. So really you want them to be in sync with each other rather than trying to tear an organization apart. But there, does that answer any of that? I don't know if I've answered your question. You're saying thank you, so presumably I have. Yeah, but maybe there's one, like if you want to jump on and chat about it, then let me know. So I think there may be some other, other angles in there that I'm not covering. Oh, there we go. So I've clicked on the approve request. Hopefully you'll be joining things.
Yep. Hi, Steve. How are you? I just thought that you might be losing aspects in the informal power structure that are actually incentives to some services. So you can have some services that have been set up because of informal power structures. So how do you disincentivize some of these, or how can you analyze this so that you understand the reason behind some services?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, I'm trying to think of an answer. And there's an echo as well. Can you mute for a second? Oh, thanks. Yeah. So yeah, that really is a good question. So I think there, again, I come back to maybe using a tool like SenseMaker to try and uncover those, right? So there's, as I've done with Modal, as you saw to begin with, so you can get a lot out of interviews and even, going out informally with lunch and speaking to people about their organization and the dynamics. So that's one way of uncovering stuff. But another would be to use a tool, especially that works for a smaller organization like that one. But for one where you've got thousands and thousands of employees, that becomes unfeasible, right? So there, something like SenseMaker would allow you to construct a way of trying to uncover this information in the first place. So. Yeah, so that would be one of my stops there. There's also so doctrine is that you can do there, but again, that may not uncover everything, right? So doctrine assessments that you can do across an organization will help you to understand how well you're implementing the 40-odd universal principles, but it may miss something like that in an informal power structure. So the question is, how do you notice it?
Yeah, because in large enterprises, there are many cases where you have services that have internal consumption, which is really just a cycle of internal consumption and not really an efficiency play.
Right. Okay. I see what you mean. Yeah. So for those, the service metrics should start to uncover some of that stuff, right? So if something exists to, almost like a loop that it's reinforcing loop in terms of like, it's keeping people employed, but for no real reason, then you can start to uncover these kind of things with the dependency analysis. And if you're seeing that kind of behavior, then, well, okay, sometimes it's by accident, sometimes intentional. And either way, right? So you can start to notice that once you've mapped it out, and then start to address it, right? So why do these services actually exist? And again, is there anything better on the market that performs those user needs? Do we even need those user needs? It becomes another question, right? So if you go back up to that example, where was it? Here somewhere, yeah, here, right? So here we've got some user needs around, from mobile development. What if you didn't need those anymore? And that's kind of what you're asking there, right? So if you don't need that anymore, then what's the point of the service? Well, okay, take away that need, you still have this one, and take away that need, and what's the point of the service? You might as well retire.
I have to compliment you. This is really, really forward thinking, and I think it has an impact that could be really strong, especially in considerations for acquisitions, for example. So having the analysis at this level as due diligence for an acquisition would be really strong.
No, that's actually a use I hadn't thought of. So there we go. I'll go speak to all the private equity firms. Right. Oh, thanks, Roberto. Appreciate it. Vicky, you have a question about complexity and adoption. If you want to join, yeah. I'm clicking on the button now. I think we've got a few more minutes. All right, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, so thank you for this. It's a very good presentation, well delivered, and a lot of very valuable information in here. As I look at it, though, as somebody who already knows all this stuff, I can look at it and go, oh, yes, of course, I know how to do that. But the people who actually have to implement this, the boots on the ground, how do they do that? I mean, there's a lot of complexity going on here, a lot of change, and a lot of learning that has to happen in order for this to be successful. What's the approach in order to make that happen?
Yeah, that's also a really good question. So here, without the support of this leadership team, and it all started out of trying to understand where the money's going, and then kind of grew from there, right? And without the support of the leadership team in saying, okay, let's go down this route and start to understand what our services are, start to define them, we wouldn't have gotten to this point, right? And for this, really, so if maybe I'll jump into Miro for a second. So there's this question of why, and then there's the how do we do stuff, right? So for each service on, for example, if I zoom into to here, right? So this is the mobile app services, as I say, and an early draft of that. Then the general idea is going through each one of these services and starting to work with whoever's been identified as an owner for those services to go and fill out this contract, right, for their service. And that means asking a whole bunch of questions. It means looking through what they're already doing. So it's quite an involved process. So it's reflective, and that's something that I'm going in and helping people do, right? So and it's different for each one, right? So it depends on how much thinking they've done about this already, and where we need to start, what kind of documentation they've got, and other things like that, even like how long have they been at the organization. So yeah, so it's not a linear process, I would say, right? And that's where, like, having somebody to guide you through it can really help. But yeah, so I do have somewhere, I can't jump over for confidentiality reasons, I can't jump over to my other board there, but I've got somewhere some like maybe some generic steps that we've gone through that I could share.
So are you finding that it's necessary to get into the whys and wherefores to teach, for instance, the people in each of these teams about Wardley maps, about these steps that were taken to get from here to there? Or, I mean, because typically I find when I work with teams, they're intelligent people, right?
Yeah.
And they want to know why, they don't simply want to be dictated to. But in this case, that's rather a steep learning curve. How do you approach that?
Yeah, again, I try and customize it for each person, right? So we start out with, so I do have a deck, like an intro deck, which this is a little bit part of, right? So why we being asked to do this, and some of these things you've seen right today, but there's a lot more. There's like maybe a 15 to 20 odd slides on intro, why we're doing this, what's the context, what's the ask, And then it really gets into the, like, how are we going to fill out this template, right? So there, you know, again, depending on the person, sometimes they go away, read it, fill it out. We have another conversation, feedback loop, go from there, kind of thing. And then for others, you know, it tends to be like, so let's start at, you know, trying to articulate all the user needs, right? So and we did this across all of the mobile space, actually, with a person that I was working with there. So we looked into you know, all of the needs for across all of these services, and wrote down something like 50 different user needs in a big long list. And then we said, okay, which user needs fit in which service, and you know, that's where we got to this point, right? So like I say, and there's even more than just the two that you see here, right? So it's yeah, the process that you take will depend on lots of stuff, and that's why I think you can't ultimately say it's going to be this. Start with user needs, I think, is probably a key bit of advice that I can give, and that's something that James Duncan, who created this stuff, that's advice that he passed on to me. So yeah, I'd start there. You don't have to do the value chains as well. Sometimes people find them confusing. Sometimes people find them useful. So again, the goal is to get the contracts written out.
So
hopefully that
it's
helps.
Yeah, no, I mean, it kind of all boils down to the standard answer where squishy humans are involved, which is it depends.
Yeah, it does, but there's still, like, you know, there's a bunch of things, like common things, that need to be done, and like I say, I can put that list together and share it if it would be useful.
Yeah, I think it'd be useful for people to, as they watch this video in the future, to be able to refer back to that.
Yeah, okay, I'm writing it down on right now. Yeah, thank you very much, Vicky. I appreciate it. I think we're pretty much out of time as well, so I don't want to make people late for the next session. So yeah, so thanks for everybody who's asking questions, and everybody else in the chat. I hope you've enjoyed the session. So yeah, I wish you excellent rest of the conference. Bye for now.